Namaskara. In this video, we will learn about multimeters. What is multimeter? How does it work? What are the types of multimeters? Basically, when it comes to multimeter, we have two types. First one is analog type and second one is digital type. Today with me, I have three multimeters. The first multimeter is this. It is a basic multimeter and an affordable one which costs around 200 rupees and it can do basic functionalities. One drawback of this multimeter is it is not very accurate. The next multimeter is this one. This has auto ranging functionality for voltage, current and resistance. This multimeter readings are more accurate when compared to the first one, and this has additional features to measure capacitance, temperature, frequency and others. The next one is analog multimeter. I think most of you would have never seen this type of multimeters. These are very old type of multimeters. This consists of a coil which is placed between two permanent magnets and a needle is placed on top of it. When the current flows through this coil, a magnetic field is generated which in turn interacts with the magnetic field of the permanent magnet. That's how needle moves, and the angle of the needle depends on the current flowing through the coil. In the top, we have DC voltage measurements. In the bottom, we have AC voltage measurements. We even have resistance measurements on the bottom from 0 to infinity. Then we have DC current measurements and AC current measurements, and below them we have resistance measurements as well. In this part, if you can see, we can measure the state of the battery, whether it is good or bad. Now, this knob is used for tuning of the multimeter. That is, if we use this multimeter after tuning, we will get better accuracy. Now let's understand this digital multimeter. If the dial is placed in the center, the multimeter will be in the off state. Now, if we move this dial to the left side, we can measure DC voltages. That is from 200 millivolts up to 1000 volts. That is 200 millivolts is equivalent to 0.2 volts, and the next step is 2000 millivolts. That is equivalent to 2 volts, and the next one is 20 volts. That is, if we are measuring any DC voltages less than 20 volts, we have to use this. This is the most frequently used settings because our car battery voltage is usually around 12 to 14 volts. Some sensors can have input voltage 5 volts or 12 volts. Now, if we switch this dial to the right side, we can measure AC voltages. That is, you can see this sinusoidal symbol, right? This denotes AC voltage, that is alternating current. The first step is 200 volts, that is for measuring AC voltages less than 200 volts. And this multimeter can measure up to 750 volts in AC. Now if we move this dial towards right side, we can measure current. That is, this measurement is used to understand power consumption of a device or a part of the circuit. In the first part, we can measure from 2000 microamps to 200 milliamps. Second block is for higher currents, that is up to 10 amps. Now if we come to the bottom part, we have resistance measurements. That is, it starts from 200 ohms and it goes up to 2000 kilo ohms. That is equivalent to 2 mega ohms. That is because K is equivalent to 10 to the power of 3, and since we have 3 zeros after 2, it becomes 10 to the power of 6. That is mega. So 2 mega ohms. This buzzer and diode selection you are seeing is for continuity and diode measurements. This is also used for testing diodes, MOSFETs, transistors. Now these three sockets you are seeing are very important. The first two is for red probe and the bottom one is for black probe. Black probe is either reference or ground or common probe, and the first two red is for measurements, and the first one is exclusively used for current measurements. Next one is used for voltage, resistance or capacitance measurements. This is done because the currents are always measured in series and voltages are always measured parallelly. That's why we should be careful while using multimeter. Select the right socket depending upon what we want to measure. Now this is a basic entry level multimeter and it is the most affordable one. If you have just started learning electronics or you want to experiment with the multimeter, this is the one I would recommend. Since it is affordable, even if you damage it or drop it, or it will be convenient to replace it. It's not very easy to damage a multimeter because multimeters are protected by fuse. That is, one fuse for parallel circuit and one fuse for series circuit. That gets blown when you try to measure a higher voltage or a higher current, or you are trying to measure current in the voltage mode or vice versa. That is, you have selected a wrong settings for that particular measurement. You just have to replace the fuse and you're good to go. And the next multimeter I have is this one. The accuracy of this multimeter is much better than the previous one. This is because when choosing the multimeter, we have to keep one parameter in mind. That is number of counts or number of samples per second. This multimeter you are seeing has 6000 counts. That is 6000 samples per second, and the previous one had just 15 or 20 samples. That means this multimeter is capable of taking 6000 samples per second and averaging it out and displaying it to you. On the other hand, the previous one can only do maximum of 20 samples per second. That's why the accuracy of this multimeter is much better than the previous one. And one more feature of this multimeter is auto ranging capability. That is, when you try to measure a voltage, there are only two settings. That is, either it is DC or AC. And after setting it, you don't have to set voltage range. One setting can measure voltage from 0 to 1000. The multimeter in turn will decide whether to show it in microvolts, millivolts or volts. And we have this feature even in the resistance mode as well. Multimeter can show from 0 ohms up to few mega ohms. In this multimeter, there is an option to measure capacitance as well. And if we go to the next settings, we can even measure temperature. They provide separate probes for measuring temperature. And there is one more settings at the end. It is called NCV. This is useful for testing of wall sockets. This is useful to check live, neutral or ground connections in the AC socket. This comes with an antenna on top, and you just have to point it near the wall socket and it will detect whether it is live, neutral or ground. Since it is a non-contact type, it is safer to use when compared to traditional electrical testers. Remember, I was telling you have to measure voltage in parallel fashion and current in series fashion, right? This multimeter has a special feature. If you observe the sockets, when I put it in the voltage mode, this LED and this LED starts blinking. This is for parallel measurements, and when we put it to resistance mode, it stays in that pattern itself. This side black and this side red. Now observe, I'll put it in the current mode. This LED shifts here. Now it is indicating we have to connect the probes here. And in both the condition, the common remains same, only the red probe we have to shift. Now this is an analog type multimeter. The main strength of this multimeter is it can detect the change very quickly compared to the digital type. That is, whenever there is a change in voltage or change in current, changes are reflected in the needle in almost real time. The main drawback of this type of multimeter is we cannot get the accurate measurements. That is, whenever we have a small voltage change, that is from 5.2 to 5.23 or 5.24 or 5.25, this is very difficult to measure in this type. Whereas in digital type, usually the multimeter comes with the accuracy up to 3 decimal places. This is easier in digital type. Now in the next part, I'll show you practical demonstration of these multimeters on the car. That is, I'll show you how to measure the battery voltage and what will be the voltage when it is not charging and when it is charging. I hope you understood my explanation on multimeter, and if you learned something, please do like and subscribe to the channel for future videos. Stay tuned for the part 2. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.